Your house is gone, Mr. Harwell. And there's nothing you can do about it.
I know. Thank you for telling me, Sandra.
Then I hung up. She heard that as surrender. I heard it as the moment she stopped being careful. Sandra Holbrook had just demolished 8 years of my life with a $41,000 fine she fabricated, a demolition order she pushed through without a hearing, without certified mail, without 30 days' notice, just excavators at my gate at 9 in the morning while I stood 1,700 miles away in a federal building in Washington, D.C. And when she called to deliver the news, I gave her nothing. No anger, no threat. No sound of a man reaching for a lawyer, just, I know. Thank you, Sandra. She thought that was the end of it. I was already saving the call to 3 separate locations. I could have stopped her 3 weeks earlier. The language in her preliminary notice told me exactly what she was planning. 1 emergency injunction filed before close of business on a Tuesday, and those machines never reach my gate. My attorneys were ready. The documentation was ready. I was ready. But if I moved then, she would have retreated, lawyered up, called it a misunderstanding, and the real case, the one that reached far beyond my property line, would have died quietly with a court filing nobody remembered. So I let her finish. I let her smile for Tom's camera in her white slacks while Margaret's wraparound deck collapsed into red dust. I let her leave that voicemail like a trophy, because the only thing more dangerous than a powerful person making a mistake is a powerful person who doesn't know they just made one. When someone hands you the rope and ties the knot themselves, is it weakness to wait, or is it the only way to make sure they can never undo it? My name is James Harwell. I am 61 years old. For 22 years, I sat on the federal appellate bench, the 10th Circuit, and I reviewed cases involving property rights, civil procedure, administrative overreach, and the quiet, grinding ways institutions abuse the people they were built to serve. I have read more HOA covenants than most attorneys. I have written opinions that shaped how homeowner associations in 4 states could and could not enforce their rules. I understood the machinery Sandra Holbrook was using against me better than she understood it herself. But none of that is why I know how to wait. I learned to wait from Margaret. My wife was a structural engineer who designed buildings meant to last 100 years. She used to say that the most dangerous moment in any construction project wasn't the pour or the frame or the finish. It was the inspection. Not because inspections were hard, because that was the moment when every shortcut, every quiet compromise, every decision made when nobody was watching became a permanent record. Patience, she told me once, is just building something so carefully that the inspection doesn't scare you. She died of pancreatic cancer 8 years ago, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. In her final weeks, weak and thin in a hospital bed that we'd moved to the window so she could see the mountains, she sketched a house on the back of a discharge summary. Floor-to-ceiling glass facing Pikes Peak, reclaimed Douglas fir, a wraparound deck she labeled in her precise engineer's hand, the place where morning actually lives. 3 days before she passed, she looked at me and said, "Build it, James. Promise me." I built it. Every beam sourced from Wyoming ranch timber, every stone laid by hand. The deck faced exactly the direction she'd drawn. I watched my first sunrise from it the April after she passed, sitting in a chair I'd bought because she would have liked the color, drinking coffee I didn't taste, talking to a woman who wasn't there. That house was not real estate. It was a kept promise. I moved into Ridgecrest Summit at 53, a widower, no children, a federal judge who had spent 2 decades watching what happened when people with institutional power decided the rules applied to everyone but themselves. I was quiet by nature, methodical by training. I kept my yard clean, paid my dues on time, introduced myself to neighbors with a handshake, and remembered their names. I did not arrive looking for a fight. But 22 years on the bench teaches you to recognize one thing above everything else: the difference between a person who makes a mistake and a person who has decided that the rules are a tool they own. Sandra Holbrook, I would learn, had made that decision 11 years ago, and nobody had ever made her answer for it. I want to tell you something about how I was raised because it matters to what comes later. My father was a county clerk in rural Kansas for 31 years. He processed deeds, recorded liens, filed plats, and maintained the chain of title for every piece of land in a county of 40,000 people. He was not a powerful man in any obvious sense. He drove a 12-year-old Ford. He brought his lunch in a paper bag. He knew every notary in the state by first name. But when someone came into his office trying to push through a filing that wasn't right, a boundary line quietly redrawn, an easement conveniently omitted, a signature that didn't quite match, my father would set the document flat on his desk, place both hands on either side of it, and say, "I'm going to need you to come back when this is correct." Not angry, not accusatory, just completely immovable. He used to tell me, "James, the mistake most people make in a confrontation is that they respond to what the other person is feeling. You respond to what the record shows. Feelings change, records don't." I carried that with me to law school, to the bench, and eventually to a craftsman house at 6,800 feet in the Colorado Rockies. When the first HOA violation notice appeared in my mailbox, 8 months after I moved in, citing my stone pathway as constructed with unapproved materials, I did not feel anger. I felt recognition. I had seen this pattern before, in courtrooms and in county offices, and in the careful paper trails that preceded every abuse of institutional authority I had ever reviewed. It starts with something small, something you could almost believe is legitimate. That's the tell. I paid the fine. I filed the receipt. I requested written confirmation that the payment had been received and the violation closed. Then I started a folder, not because I planned to sue Sandra Holbrook, not yet, because my father's 31 years behind that desk had taught me that the person who controls the paper controls the story, and I had no intention of letting someone else control mine. There's a principle I came back to again and again during the months that followed. Speaking too soon only rescues the other person from their own mistakes. A premature confrontation gives the adversary time to adjust, to retreat, to clean up the edges of what they've done. Let them keep going. Let them build the structure they're building. A case made of one violation is a nuisance. A case made of 40 violations, 2 years of time-stamped correspondence, and a demolition order issued without due process, that is something else entirely. I didn't want to make Sandra Holbrook uncomfortable for a week. I wanted the record to be so complete, so undeniable, so exhaustively documented that no attorney she could hire and no board she controlled could offer an explanation that held. That kind of record takes time. I was willing to give it the time it needed. How certain of yourself do you have to be to let someone keep walking toward the edge, knowing you're the only one in the room who can see how close they are? Let me be precise about what Sandra Holbrook was actually threatening. Not just a house. Not just square footage and timber and stone. Anyone who reduces Margaret's home to real estate has missed the point entirely. But I need you to understand the full weight of what was sitting on the table, because the stakes of a decision to wait are only meaningful if you understand exactly what waiting could cost. The house was appraised at $2.3 million. 8 years of my life, built by hand and by promise, sitting on 3 acres at 6,800 feet with an unobstructed view of Pikes Peak. Irreplaceable in the literal sense. The reclaimed Douglas fir came from 3 Wyoming ranches that no longer existed. The stone was quarried from a source that had since been closed. If that house came down, it could not be rebuilt. Not that house, not Margaret's house. Beyond the structure itself, I had announced my candidacy for governor of Colorado 4 months earlier. The campaign was real, the polling was favorable, and my opponents were watching everything. A public, ugly dispute with a homeowners association, one that could be framed, however dishonestly, as a wealthy man refusing to follow community rules, was exactly the kind of story that travels fast and corrects slowly. Sandra knew my name was in the news. She had watched the announcement. She had, as I would later confirm, discussed it in writing with at least 2 board members. The timing was not accidental. And underneath all of it, quieter than the property value, quieter than the political exposure, was something I couldn't put in a legal filing. That deck was the last place I felt close to Margaret. Sunday mornings, before the campaign, before the obligations, I would sit in that chair facing Pikes Peak with a cup of coffee, and I would talk to her. About the week, about the cases I'd closed, about whether I was making the right choices. It was not rational. I am a man who spent 22 years demanding that arguments be grounded in evidence, but grief doesn't file briefs. If Sandra took that house, she wasn't just taking timber and glass. She was taking the last geography of something I couldn't replace. I knew all of this. I weighed all of this. I sat with the full cost of what I might lose if my patience miscalculated by even one step, and I chose to wait anyway. The violations didn't stop at the stone pathway. Over the following 8 months, Sandra Holbrook's HOA board issued 14 separate notices against my property. My contractor's truck, parked on a Saturday during a scheduled renovation. Commercial vehicle violation, $200. The drought-resistant native grasses Margaret had specified in her original landscaping plan, grasses that had been reviewed and signed off by the county's Water Conservation Office. Unkempt appearance, $150. A motion sensor light installed on the north corner of the garage, facing inward toward my own driveway. Unapproved exterior modification, $175. Each one was small. Each one was documented. Each one was paid. But around the 4th notice, something shifted in the pattern, and I want to be precise about when I noticed it, because this is the moment the folder stopped being a precaution and became a case. The 4th violation cited my wraparound deck as having been constructed with non-compliant railing height. I pulled the original architectural approval letter Sandra's predecessor had signed 7 years earlier. The railing height was explicitly approved, dimension by dimension, material by material. The approval was in writing and on file. I sent a copy to the board with a polite note and a request that the violation be withdrawn. Sandra did not withdraw it. She reduced the fine by $30 and called it resolved. That was not a mistake. Mistakes get corrected when you show someone the evidence. What Sandra did was look at the evidence, understand that she was wrong, and proceed anyway, because she had calculated correctly that I would pay rather than escalate. She was right. I did pay. What she didn't calculate was why. I paid because I needed her to believe that paying was my ceiling. I needed her to believe that James Harwell, federal judge, gubernatorial candidate, man with a fireproof safe full of receipts, would absorb whatever she issued and never push back. The moment she believed that, she would stop being careful. She would move faster. She would get sloppy. She would leave things in writing she would later regret. People who believe they are not being watched make a very different quality of mistake than people who know they are. I set up a separate email folder. Every notice, every response, every board communication, printed in duplicate and filed chronologically, with a backup copy stored off-site at my attorney's office in Denver. Not because I'd retained him yet, because 22 years on the bench had taught me that the moment you need a document is never the moment you expected to need it. Sandra was issuing violations faster now. The intervals were shortening. 3 weeks between the 1st and 2nd, 11 days between the 3rd and 4th, 8 days between the 4th and 5th. She wasn't slowing down. She was accelerating. Have you ever watched someone move faster and faster towards something they couldn't see and understood that the only responsible thing to do was let them arrive? 6 months in, I had my first real opportunity to end it. A neighbor, I'll call him David because he asked me not to use his name, knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening in late October. He was 64, a retired civil engineer, had lived in Ridgecrest Summit for 9 years. He stood on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. He told me that Sandra had approached him at the previous month's board meeting and asked him to sign a supplemental complaint against my property. Specifically, a document alleging that my landscaping created drainage interference affecting neighboring lots. David's lot was the one directly adjacent to mine on the eastern side. His signature would have given the complaint standing it otherwise lacked. He had not signed it. More importantly, he had kept the document. He handed me a photocopy across my threshold. I read it once, slowly. Sandra's name was on it. 2 board members had already signed. The allegation was fabricated. My landscaping had been designed by a certified hydrologist. The drainage study was on file with the county, and there had been 0 complaints from any neighboring property in 8 years. This was not a technicality dispute. This was a document created for the purpose of manufacturing a violation that didn't exist, solicited from a neighbor under social pressure, and designed to expand the legal footprint of Sandra's campaign against my property. I could have taken that document to a Colorado State Bar ethics line the next morning. I could have called the county assessor's office. I could have walked into Sandra's next board meeting, set the photocopy on the table, and watched her explain it in front of 17 homeowners. Instead, I said, "David, thank you. I mean that." I made him a copy of my drainage study, not because he needed it, but because I wanted him to understand that I had it. I shook his hand. I told him that what he'd done took integrity. Then I closed the door, walked to my office, and added the document to the folder with a note in the margin. Unsolicited, unprompted, delivered voluntarily. Credibility high. I did not confront Sandra, not because I was afraid of her reaction, because a confrontation at that moment would have told her exactly how much I knew and exactly where my line was. She would have stopped. She would have consulted an attorney. She would have been more careful. And I needed Sandra Holbrook to keep being exactly as careless as she had been. The warning I gave her was not a conversation. It was the fact that I paid every fine on time, responded to every notice politely, and never once raised my voice. I wanted her to believe there was nothing behind the door. Is there a version of restraint that isn't weakness, but is actually the most precise kind of pressure you can apply? By month 10, I had stopped thinking of Sandra's violations as harassment. I had started thinking of them as testimony. Every notice she issued was a statement under her signature. Every fine she levied without proper authorization was a data point. Every board decision made without a recorded vote was a procedural gap. I wasn't just collecting grievances, I was watching a pattern crystallize into something a forensic accountant could work with and a civil rights attorney could argue in front of a jury. I began cross-referencing. The HOA's own governing documents required a 2/3 board vote before any fine exceeding $500 could be issued. I pulled the meeting minutes for the previous 3 years. They were public record, available through the county clerk's office, the same office my father had run for 31 years, and I went through them line by line. Of the 23 fines Sandra had issued against various Ridgecrest Summit homeowners in that period, 11 had no corresponding recorded vote. 4 had votes recorded with only 2 board members present when the bylaws required 3. None of those homeowners had challenged the fines. Most had simply paid. I started a second folder. I also noticed something about the contractors Sandra's board hired for common area maintenance. The same 2 companies, rotating, both registered to addresses that a simple county records search connected to Frank Holbrook, Sandra's husband. The board had never put the contracts out for competitive bid. Nobody had ever asked why. Sandra didn't know I spent my Sunday mornings at the county clerk's office instead of watching football. She didn't know I had requested copies of 7 years of HOA financial disclosures under Colorado's open records provisions for common interest communities. She didn't know that a former colleague of mine, a retired FBI white-collar investigator named Ray Colton, had agreed, informally and without compensation, to look at what I was finding and tell me whether it was worth pursuing. Ray looked at the contractor records for 40 minutes. Then he called me and said 4 words. "James, keep going. Everything." The day after Ray's call, I made 3 phone calls of my own. The first was to Marcus Webb, a civil rights attorney out of Denver who had spent the last decade litigating cases involving institutional abuse of authority. He had just finished a $14 million verdict against a county sheriff's department for systematic property rights violations. I had read his briefs. They were precise, methodical, and built like load-bearing structures. He answered on the second ring. I told him I had a situation I wanted him to look at. I told him I wasn't ready to file anything. I told him I needed someone who understood the difference between a case that was ready and a case that was almost ready, and who had the patience to know which one they were looking at. He said, "Send me what you have." The second call was to Patricia Osei, a land use attorney with 4 Colorado Supreme Court arguments on her record and a particular expertise in HOA governance law, covenant enforcement limits, and the due process requirements that common interest community boards were legally obligated to follow before taking action against a homeowner's property. Patricia's first question, after I described the demolition order language I'd seen in Sandra's preliminary notice, was not about my property. It was, "How many other homeowners has she done this to?" I told her I was still finding out. She told me to keep finding out. The third call was to a forensic accountant named Helen Cho, who had spent 12 years as a financial examiner for the Colorado Division of Real Estate before entering private practice. I gave her the contractor records, the financial disclosures, and Ray's initial notes. I asked her to tell me what she saw. She called back in 4 days with a spreadsheet. $31,000 in common area maintenance contracts paid to Frank Holbrook's companies over 6 years with no competitive bidding documentation, no board approval minutes, and in 3 instances invoices for work that the property management logs showed had never been performed. $31,000 that Ridgecrest Summit homeowners, including me, had paid in dues, redirected into the pocket of the HOA president's husband. I added Helen's spreadsheet to the folder. I added Patricia's legal analysis. I added Marcus's preliminary case assessment. Then I went home, sat on Margaret's deck, watched the sun move across Pikes Peak, and did not make another move for 3 weeks. The folder was not ready yet, but it was getting there. While I was building the case quietly, Sandra was not standing still. 3 weeks after I retained Marcus and Patricia, while I was sitting on documentation that could have stopped her in her tracks, Sandra issued a cumulative fine summary. 17 individual violations, bundled together under a single notice, totaling $6,200. The letter cited a provision in the HOA's governing documents that allowed the board to aggregate unpaid fines after 90 days and apply a 15% administrative surcharge. The fines were not unpaid. I had cashier's checks for every single one. I sent copies of all 17 receipts to the board by certified mail, with a polite cover letter requesting written confirmation that the cumulative notice be withdrawn and my account marked current. I kept the tone flat and procedural, the way my father kept his voice flat when someone brought him a document that wasn't right. Sandra's response arrived 11 days later. She acknowledged 12 of the 17 payments. The remaining 5, she claimed, had been applied to prior outstanding balances that predated my residency, a provision that did not exist anywhere in the governing documents I had read 3 times through. She was inventing debt. The surcharge stood. The cumulative notice stood. And attached to Sandra's response was something new, a formal declaration that my account had been referred to the HOA's collections process, which under Colorado law triggered a lien filing against my property. A lien against Margaret's house. I sat with that letter for a long time. I want to be honest about what that felt like. Not as a judge, not as a gubernatorial candidate, not as a man with a folder full of documentation and 3 attorneys on speed dial. As a person who had built that house with his hands and his grief and a promise he intended to keep. It felt like a fist through glass. I did not call Sandra. I did not call Marcus. I went to my office, opened the folder, added the lien notice with a timestamp, and wrote 1 line in the margin. She just handed me the property rights violation. Then I closed the folder and made dinner. The lien was filed on a Thursday. By the following Monday, Sandra had made it public. Not through official channels, through the Ridgecrest Summit Community Forum, a private Facebook group with 340 members, every homeowner in the development, and several of their adult children. Sandra posted a notice at 7:43 in the morning, before most people had finished their coffee, informing the community that a property in the development was currently under active collections proceedings due to repeated non-compliance and unpaid assessments. She didn't use my name. She didn't need to. There were 340 people in that group. Everyone knew whose stone pathway had been cited. Everyone had watched the violation notices accumulate, and Sandra's post came 4 days after local news had run a piece on my gubernatorial campaign, which meant that by noon, 2 political blogs had connected the dots and run items about a Colorado governor candidate with an HOA lien on his mountain property. The calls started coming in to my campaign office. My communications director, a careful woman named Ellen Park, who had managed 2 Senate campaigns, called me at 2 in the afternoon and read me the questions she was fielding from journalists. Was the lien legitimate? Had I failed to pay my HOA dues? Was there a pattern of non-compliance with community rules? Ellen was too professional to say what she was thinking, but I could hear it in the pause before she spoke. I told her, "Tell them the matter is being addressed, and we'll have a full statement when appropriate." She said, "James, is there something I should know?" I said, "Yes, but not yet." That same evening, Sandra appeared on a local talk radio program, invited, I later confirmed, by a host who had donated to my opponent's campaign, and said, without using my name but with enough specificity to leave no ambiguity, "There are people in this community who believe their position exempts them from the rules everyone else has to follow. That's not how Ridgecrest Summit works. That's not how I work." The host said, "Sounds like someone's finding out you don't back down." Sandra laughed, warm, comfortable, certain. The laugh of a person who has just watched their opponent fail to respond and has decided that silence means surrender. "Some people," she said, "just don't have the stomach for a real fight." I was listening in my car, parked outside my Denver campaign office, notepad open on the passenger seat. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the station. I wrote down her exact words. How much does a person have to misunderstand you before their confidence becomes the most useful thing they've ever given you? Sandra's radio appearance was on a Wednesday. By Friday, the system had started moving. Not because I pushed it, but because Sandra had pushed it far enough that it began moving on its own. The first domino was the lien. Patricia Osei had flagged something in the filing that I had noted but not yet acted on. Under Colorado's Common Interest Ownership Act, a homeowners association is required to provide written notice of any lien filing to the affected homeowner by certified mail, return receipt requested, no fewer than 30 days before the lien is recorded with the county. Sandra had sent notice by standard first-class mail, 11 days before recording. That was not a technicality. That was a statutory violation. The lien, as filed, was legally defective. Patricia filed a quiet challenge with the county recorder's office. Not a lawsuit, not a press release, just a formal administrative objection with the relevant statute cited and my 17 cashier's check receipts attached. Procedural, precise, invisible to anyone not looking for it. The county recorder's office placed the lien in review status within 48 hours. The second domino was Helen Cho's spreadsheet. Ray Colton, my former FBI colleague who had been reviewing the contractor records informally, made a call to a contact at the Colorado Division of Real Estate. Not a complaint, a conversation. He described, in general terms, a pattern of HOA financial irregularities he had been asked to review and asked whether the division had received any prior complaints about the association in question. They had. 2, both from homeowners who had since sold their properties and left the development. Both filed, reviewed, and closed without action because neither complainant had financial documentation to support their allegations. Helen's spreadsheet was financial documentation. Ray's contact asked him to submit it through the division's formal intake process. The third domino was Frank Holbrook. Frank, Sandra's husband, had been listed on the HOA's website as the board's security and compliance consultant, a role that had never appeared in any board meeting minutes, had never been put to a homeowner vote, and was compensated, according to Helen's records, at $1,400 per month drawn from the association's operating fund. When Helen traced the payment history, she found that Frank's compensation had continued uninterrupted for 6 years, including during 2 periods when the board had formally suspended all discretionary spending due to budget shortfalls. Every other homeowner in Ridgecrest Summit had paid increased dues during those shortfalls. The money had partially gone to Frank Holbrook. Marcus Webb sent a formal litigation hold notice to the HOA board, Sandra personally, and the association's property management company. The notice required them to preserve all financial records, board communications, and correspondence related to fine assessments and contractor payments for the preceding 7 years. It was not a lawsuit. It was the legal equivalent of a hand placed flat on a desk. By the end of that week, 4 things had happened that Sandra did not know about: a lien in administrative review, a state regulatory intake, a financial investigation with documentary support, and a litigation hold that had just made every board member personally responsible for the integrity of their records. Sandra, meanwhile, was preparing for her next board meeting, where she planned to formalize the collections process against my property. She thought she was accelerating. She was accelerating into a wall she couldn't see yet. There was one person in Ridgecrest Summit who had figured out what I was doing. Her name was Constance Adeyemi, 67 years old, retired federal prosecutor, had lived 3 houses down from me for 6 years. We had the kind of neighborly relationship built on occasional front porch conversations, a shared preference for quiet mornings, and a mutual understanding that neither of us needed to fill silence with noise. Constance had watched the violation notices accumulate. She had seen the lien filing appear in the county records. She checked them periodically, old habit from her prosecutorial years. She had been at the board meeting where Sandra announced the collections referral, sitting in the 3rd row with her hands folded in her lap and her expression giving away nothing. She came to my door on a Sunday morning in early December, 3 months after the lien was filed. I was sitting on Margaret's deck with coffee when I heard the knock. She stood on my porch in a wool coat, looked at me for a moment, and said, "You're not going to lose this house." It wasn't a question. It wasn't reassurance. It was the assessment of a woman who had spent 28 years reading defendants and witnesses and juries, and who had just finished reading me. I said, "No, I'm not." She nodded once. Then she said, "Sandra came to me last week, asked me to submit a written statement supporting the collections action, character of the community, that kind of thing." I waited. "I told her I hadn't observed anything that would support such a statement," Constance said. She didn't like that answer. I thanked her. I did not tell her about the folder. I did not tell her about Marcus or Patricia or Helen or Ray. I did not tell her about the lien challenge or the division of real estate intake or the litigation hold. But before she turned to leave, she paused at the top of my porch steps and said, without looking back, "Whatever you're building, make sure it's load-bearing before you move in." I smiled for the first time in 3 months. She walked back down the path, hands in her coat pockets, unhurried, the way people move when they've already seen how most things end and have made their peace with the waiting. I went inside and added her name to the witness section of the folder. In January, 2 things happened that changed the tempo of everything. The first, I won the gubernatorial primary by 11 points. The campaign moved from possible to real, from theoretical to scheduled, from a conversation to a countdown. My inauguration was set for the 2nd week of March. My transition team was assembled. My calendar from January through April was a document of obligations. Federal briefings, legislative sessions, cabinet appointments, infrastructure summits in Washington, D.C. The second, Sandra filed for an expedited demolition authorization. Patricia called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying the particular flatness of an attorney delivering news she has already processed so you don't have to watch her process it. The HOA had engaged a Colorado Springs law firm, expensive, aggressive, known for fast-moving property enforcement actions. They had filed a petition with the El Paso County District Court citing my property's alleged $41,000 in accumulated unpaid assessments and requesting emergency authorization for structural remediation, which was the legal language for demolition. The 30-day response window opened the following morning. I sat with that information for approximately 4 minutes. Then I called Marcus. Marcus was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, They filed in El Paso County. Your property is in Teller County. Wrong jurisdiction. The filing was procedurally defective from the first page. But here was the problem. Procedural defects in emergency petitions can be corrected. Sandra's attorneys would catch the error within days, refile in the correct jurisdiction, and restart the clock. We had one response window, 30 days in the wrong court, followed immediately by a new 30 days in the right one. 60 days total, if we were fortunate. Less if Sandra's attorneys moved quickly on the refile. 60 days. Marcus said we needed to be ready to walk into the Teller County Quarterly HOA Town Hall, scheduled for the second week of March, the same week as my inauguration, with everything, not almost everything, everything. The fine receipts, the lien challenge, the division of real estate intake, Helen's contractor's spreadsheet, the fabricated drainage complaint David had brought to my door, the radio transcript, the Facebook post, the emails Sandra had written about my campaign, the video Tom had taken of Sandra smiling while Margaret's deck collapsed. Every piece of it, organized, sourced, and ready to be presented to 340 homeowners and whatever press coverage a newly inaugurated governor's HOA dispute would inevitably attract. "How much do you have?" Marcus asked. I told him about the folder. I told him about the second folder. I told him about the backup copies at his office that he hadn't opened yet. There was a pause. "James," he said slowly, "how long have you been building this?" "Since month 1, I said. Another pause. "Longer this time." "All right," he said. "Then let's finish it." When the clock finally starts running, does it feel like pressure or like relief that the waiting is almost over? Marcus spent 3 days going through the backup folders at his office. He called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked me to come in. I drove to Denver on a Friday morning, parked in the garage beneath his building, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. His paralegal met me at the reception desk and walked me to the conference room without small talk, the kind of purposeful silence that meant something had been found. Marcus was standing at the head of the table. Spread across its full length were printed documents, organized into labeled sections with color-coded tabs. Helen Cho was there. Patricia Osei was there. Ray Colton sat in the corner chair with a legal pad on his knee and a pen he hadn't uncapped. Marcus said, "Sit down, James." I sat. He walked me through it, section by section. Helen had finished her audit of 7 years of HOA financial records. The contractor payments to Frank Holbrook's companies totaled not $31,000, as her preliminary review had shown, but $74,200. The difference accounted for by a second set of invoices she had found buried in the property management company's supplemental records, filed under a vendor code that didn't match the company names on the contracts. Someone had tried to obscure them. Not well enough. Patricia laid out the due process violations in the demolition petition, not just the wrong jurisdiction filing, but 4 separate failures to comply with Colorado's mandatory homeowner notification requirements. No certified mail, no mandatory pre-action hearing, no 30-day cure period, no board vote recorded in the minutes. Any one of those failures would have been sufficient to invalidate the demolition authorization. All 4 together constituted what Patricia called, in the measured language of a Supreme Court practitioner, a remarkably complete record of procedural bad faith. Then Ray uncapped his pen. He had spent 2 weeks cross-referencing Sandra's HOA email communications, obtained through Colorado's open records provisions for common interest communities, with the timeline of my gubernatorial campaign. What he found was a thread of 14 emails sent between Sandra and 2 board members over a 4-month period that documented with painful specificity her intent to use the HOA enforcement process to damage my campaign. The most direct was sent 3 days after my inauguration announcement. Sandra had written, "Harwell winning would bring the wrong kind of attention to this community. We need him out before November. I'm accelerating the collections timeline." That single sentence transformed the entire case. What had been a property rights dispute and a financial misconduct investigation became something with a different legal weight entirely. Targeted enforcement action motivated by political opposition. Marcus had already spoken to a colleague who specialized in civil rights litigation. The phrase he used was selective enforcement as political retaliation. The damages exposure, he said quietly, was significant. I looked at the table. At 3 years of patience laid out in labeled sections under conference room lights. At the complete, sourced, legally organized record of everything Sandra Holbrook had done, said, written, and hidden. Margaret used to say that a well-built structure announces itself not by how it looks on the outside, but by how it holds when you put weight on it. I put my hands flat on the table. It held. Sandra refiled in Teller County on a Monday. Her attorneys were faster than Marcus had anticipated, not 30 days, but 9. The new petition landed in the correct jurisdiction, properly formatted, with a revised fine total of $41,000 and a supporting declaration from Sandra herself describing my property as a community liability and my non-compliance as willful and sustained. The emergency authorization was granted 4 days later. I was in Washington, D.C. when it happened. Federal Infrastructure Summit, 4th floor conference room, Deputy Secretary explaining bond allocation. My phone lit up at 9:14 in the morning with Tom's image. Margaret's wraparound deck collapsing sideways into red dust, and Sandra's voicemail arrived 8 minutes later. "Your house is gone, Mr. Harwell, and there's nothing you can do about it." I want to be honest about what the next 6 hours felt like. I sat in that conference room for another 40 minutes after Tom's photo came through, because the meeting required my presence and because leaving would have told everyone in that room that something had broken. I held my face still. I answered 2 direct questions from the deputy secretary. I shook hands at the close of the session with a steadiness I had to consciously manufacture, the way you manufacture steadiness when the alternative is something you cannot afford in public. Then I walked to a men's room on the 3rd floor, stood at the sink with the water running, and looked at Tom's photo for a long time. 6 hours. That was how long it took Sandra's crew to reduce 8 years to rubble. The reclaimed Douglas fir Margaret had specified from Wyoming ranches, gone. The floor-to-ceiling glass facing Pikes Peak, gone. The stone pathway Sandra had cited in her very first violation notice, the one that started the folder, the one my father would have recognized immediately as the tell, gone. And the wraparound deck, the place where morning actually lives, the place where I had sat every Sunday for 8 years talking to a woman who wasn't there, gone. Margaret's fireproof safe was recovered from the rubble by Tom and a neighbor 3 hours after the demolition. The anniversary combination still worked. Inside, the folder, 3 years of documentation, organized, tabbed, intact. Tom texted me a photo of it sitting in the dirt beside a pile of reclaimed timber that had once been a promise. I chartered a flight back that afternoon. The political coverage was immediate and brutal. By evening, 3 news outlets had run pieces framing the demolition as a story about a newly inaugurated governor who had failed to manage a basic property dispute. One headline read, "Governor Harwell's mountain home demolished amid HOA dispute." Sandra's PR firm had already issued a statement describing the action as a necessary and lawful enforcement of community standards, applied equally to all residents, regardless of political position. My communications director called me on the tarmac. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "James, I need to know right now. Do we have something?" I looked out the small window of the chartered plane at the dark outline of the Rockies below. "Ellen," I said, "in 60 days, Sandra Holbrook is going to stand in front of every homeowner in that development, every journalist covering this story, and every camera her PR firm has invited, and she is going to hand me the microphone." Silence. "Make sure the room is full," I said. When you've already lost the thing that mattered most, what does it feel like to know that the person who took it just made the last mistake they'll ever make? The night I flew back from Washington, I didn't go to the rubble. I knew what was there. Tom had sent photographs. Marcus had already dispatched a preservation team to document the site before anything was moved or disturbed. The legal process had begun absorbing the demolition as evidence the moment it happened. There was nothing I needed to see in person that the record hadn't already captured. Instead, I drove to a storage unit in Colorado Springs where I kept the things that hadn't fit in Margaret's house. Boxes from our previous home, her drafting table, 2 filing cabinets of her engineering drawings. I sat on the concrete floor in my inauguration week suit with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and I opened the box I hadn't opened since the year she died. Her cocktail napkin sketches, dozens of them, buildings, bridges, load calculations scrawled in the margins of dinner menus, and near the bottom, folded into thirds on the back of a hospital discharge summary, the house, her house, 4,800 square feet, floor-to-ceiling glass, wraparound deck, labeled in her precise hand, the place where mourning actually lives. I had built every line of it.
I sat with that drawing for a long time, and I let myself feel what I had been carefully not feeling for 3 years. Not the anger. I had metabolized the anger into documentation long ago. Something quieter and heavier than anger. The particular grief of a person who built something as an act of love and watched it destroyed as an act of contempt. Margaret had spent her career designing structures meant to outlast the people who built them. She believed that the most honest thing a person could make was something that would still be standing when they were gone. That house was supposed to outlast me. It was supposed to be the thing I left behind when I had nothing left to leave. Sandra Holbrook had reduced it to rubble in 6 hours. And here is what I understood sitting on that concrete floor. The reason I had waited was not strategic patience in the abstract. It was not a courtroom technique or a litigation posture. It was something simpler and more personal than that. I had waited because I needed what came next to be permanent, not a temporary injunction, not a fine paid and a violation closed. Permanent. The kind of accountability that doesn't get appealed, amended, or quietly settled into nothing. Margaret built things to last. I had learned, finally, to do the same. I folded the drawing carefully, put it in my jacket pocket, and drove to Denver. The town hall was in 58 days. The Ridgecrest Summit Quarterly Town Hall was held on a Thursday evening in the second week of March in the development's community center. A low, well-lit building with folding chairs, a podium, and a projection screen that Sandra used for her annual HOA report presentations. Ellen had made sure the room was full. 312 homeowners attended, the highest turnout in the association's 11-year history. 12 journalists were credentialed, local news, 2 Denver outlets, 1 national wire service that had been following the governor's HOA story since the demolition. Sandra's PR firm had arranged for a photographer and a communications consultant who sat in the back row with a laptop open. Sandra arrived 7 minutes early in a charcoal blazer, her hair precisely set, moving through the room with the confidence of a person who has spent 11 years being the most powerful figure in every room she enters. She greeted board members by name, shook hands with homeowners she recognized, and took her position at the podium with the ease of long practice. I arrived 4 minutes before the meeting opened and sat in the third row. Sandra saw me when I sat down. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise because she had known I would be there, but a recalibration, a brief, involuntary adjustment. Then she composed herself and looked back at her notes. She thought I had come to object, to make a statement, to ask angry questions from the floor like a man who had run out of better options. She opened the meeting at 7 o'clock precisely. The first 40 minutes proceeded according to her agenda: budget review, landscaping contracts for the coming year, a proposal for new guest parking restrictions. Sandra ran it with the fluency of someone who had done this 87 times and intended to do it 87 more. The room was attentive but not warm. I noticed 3 homeowners in the second row who had not looked at Sandra directly since the meeting opened. At 7:42, Sandra moved to the final agenda item: a formal board resolution to close the Harwell enforcement action as successfully completed and to ratify the demolition authorization retroactively. She read the resolution aloud. She asked for board approval. 2 members raised their hands. She declared it passed and reached for her gavel. I stood up. "Point of order," I said. The room went very still. Sandra looked at me with the measured patience of a person humoring a formality. "Mr. Harwell, if you'd like to address the board, there's a public comment period at—" "This isn't public comment," I said.
This is a procedural objection to a resolution being ratified without disclosure of material facts that directly affect its validity. Under Colorado's Common Interest Ownership Act, Section 38-33.3-209.5, homeowners have the right to present evidence relevant to any enforcement action at any duly noticed board meeting. This meeting was duly noticed. I have evidence. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of an audience watching a formality. The silence of 300 people understanding that something was about to change. Marcus stepped through the side door. Patricia was behind him. Ray carried 2 banker's boxes to the table at the front of the room. Helen Cho sat down at the laptop connected to the projection screen. Sandra's communications consultant closed his laptop. I walked to the front of the room and turned to face the homeowners, not the board, not Sandra, but the 300 people who had been paying dues to an association that had been using their money in ways they did not know. I spoke for 31 minutes. I presented the 17 cashier's checks, projected full screen, each one time-stamped, each one showing Sandra's association as the recipient. I presented the certified mail records confirming delivery. I presented Patricia's analysis of the 4 due process failures in the demolition authorization. I presented Helen's complete financial audit, $74,200 in contractor payments to companies registered to Frank Holbrook, including the buried invoices, including the payments made during the 2 budget shortfall periods when homeowner dues had been increased. Then I presented Sandra's emails, every one of the 14, projected in sequence, time-stamped, with the relevant passages highlighted. The board members who had received them sat very still. The 2 who had just voted to ratify the demolition authorization were not looking at the screen. The final email, "We need him out before November. I'm accelerating the collections timeline," stayed on the screen for a long moment. The room was completely silent. Then Tom stood up from the back row and played the video on his phone through the room's speaker system. 47 seconds. Sandra in white slacks, arms loosely crossed, smiling as Margaret's wraparound deck gave way. I let the video finish. I let the silence hold for 3 seconds after it ended. Then I turned to Sandra. She was gripping the podium with both hands. Her communications consultant had left the room. The photographer was still shooting. "I didn't come here tonight to embarrass you," I said. "I came here because 300 families in this development deserve to know how their money has been spent and why their HOA president used this association as a political weapon. They deserved to know that a long time ago. I apologize that it took this long to give them the chance." I paused. "I didn't stay silent because I was afraid of you, Sandra. I stayed silent because every time you kept going, you gave me something else I needed, and I needed all of it." Marcus stood and formally served Sandra with the civil complaint, property rights violations, selective enforcement as political retaliation, financial misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, in front of every journalist, every camera, and every homeowner in the room. Patricia simultaneously filed the complete case with the Colorado Division of Real Estate. Ray handed the financial documentation to the El Paso County Sheriff's investigator who had been sitting, at my prior arrangement, in the last row since 6:45. Sandra Holbrook released the podium. She looked at me once, not with anger, not with defiance, but with the specific expression of a person who has just understood, too late, that the silence they mistook for surrender was something else entirely. She walked out of the room without speaking. The photographer caught her at the door. That photograph, not the smile over the rubble, but this one, became the one the wire services ran the next morning. The civil case settled 8 months later. I will not disclose the full terms because some of them are sealed. What I can tell you is this: the settlement was not small. It was not quiet, and it was not the kind of document that leaves room for anyone to claim a misunderstanding. Sandra Holbrook resigned from the HOA board the morning after the town hall, before the Denver papers had finished printing. Frank's security consulting contract was terminated the same day. The Colorado Division of Real Estate opened a formal investigation into the association's financial practices within 2 weeks of Patricia's filing. Helen Cho was retained as the court-appointed financial monitor for the association's accounts during the investigation period, a role she described to me with characteristic understatement as clarifying. The El Paso County Sheriff's Office completed its review of the contractor payment records 4 months later and referred the matter to the district attorney. I will leave the outcome of that referral to public record. 3 of the homeowners who had paid fabricated fines under Sandra's tenure, people who had simply paid and moved on because they didn't know they had another option, received formal refunds from the association's reserve fund as part of the settlement terms. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria Marsh, who had been cited 7 times in 3 years for a wind chime Sandra found aesthetically objectionable, called my office to say thank you. She cried a little. I did too, though I waited until after I hung up. Constance Adeyemi was elected HOA president at the emergency board election held 6 weeks after the town hall. She ran unopposed. Her first act was to commission an independent audit of all fine assessments issued in the preceding 4 years. Her second was to have the governing documents amended to require that all contractor bids above $5,000 go through a competitive process with recorded board approval. She called me after the amendment passed and said, "Your father would have filed this correctly." I told her I thought so too. The 3-acre lot at 6,800 feet is still mine. The rubble has been cleared. The reclaimed Douglas fir is gone. I was right that it couldn't be replaced, but a salvage architect I found through Margaret's professional network has identified timber from 3 Montana ranches that she believes Margaret would have approved. The plans are drawn. The permits are filed. The foundation pour is scheduled for late spring. I still have the hospital discharge summary with Margaret's sketch on the back. It lives in the fireproof safe, which survived the demolition without a scratch. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. The wraparound deck, labeled in her precise engineer's hand. The notation in the corner that I didn't notice until the 3rd time I looked. A small arrow pointing east toward Pikes Peak, and 2 words written so small I almost missed them. True bearing. I am going to build it again. Every beam, every stone, every piece of glass facing the mountain she loved. The place where morning actually lives. I kept my promise once. I will keep it again. If you've ever been targeted by someone who mistook your patience for weakness, document everything. Start today, because the most powerful thing you can build isn't a case. It's a record so complete, so carefully kept, so undeniably true that when the moment finally comes, all you have to do is open the folder.